So the main lever. Put a wipe of molybdenum paste around the inside, around the outside edge, and on the bird paw, and on the tab on the bird paw there. I'll swing this tab across under here to cock the flash sync mechanism. That pulls the lever out of the way, so it's easier to get this spring down in position underneath it. Make sure that B lever is lifted out of position. That's good. Hold back that. Make sure that's in. That's in. That's all seated. Hook the spring over its post. Now there's a fine spring here, has to come round to this lever. So lift that in and hook it into position there. Now that should be ready to go. So the shutter speed cam ring, I normally put a wipe of molybdenum around the inside surface, around the cam surface here where it picks up on the retard gear train, and then there's the surface that the high speed spring runs on. So that inside edge there and in here, that's where it picks up this spring, which is tensioned for the 500th of a second speed. I'll lower this into place. Now you have to be careful to get the B lever out from underneath it. You don't want that trapped underneath. So the shutter's set to B now. If I cock it, that works fine. This should be 1 second. That sounds credible. And 1/10 of a second is about here. And that sounds good. A 25th of a second's here. And that sounds good. If the position of the retard gear train is incorrect, you can end up in a funny situation where the 25th and the 10th speed sound much the same, or one of them will fail to work altogether. But that all sounds very good to me. That's fine, and that shutter can be closed up now. So I'll just clean up the front retainer. These parts are comparatively clean. I mean, the shutter's certainly been serviced some stage in the past. Some people use more lubricant than others. Some people like to butter the shutters up with graphite grease. This shutter, if anything, lacked lubrication, and it certainly hadn't been over lubricated. So as a result, it's comparatively clean. There we go. So that's in place. This can go back in the case, but first of all I've got to find a plastic insulating slug to replace the one that was missing from here. Well, here I have a small piece of plastic to serve as the insulated slug. It's about 1.5 millimeters long, and it's less than 1 millimeter in diameter. It's not the original, but it'll do the job. So let's get this case in position. I'm just wiping that case out to make sure there's no sticky grease. The flash wire has to go down into the hole, and holding it there, drop my little plastic insulating slug down into the hole. and then the small black screw that holds that in position. So the end of the wire is held to the contact inside by the insulated plastic slug being pushed into position by that screw. The way it was organised earlier was that the screw was directly driven into the flash wire, which means that the flash contact was effectively shorted to the case. In other words, the flash wouldn't work. It would fire the flash as soon as it was connected to the camera. I just wiped the rack clean, and I've wiped a bit of molybdenum paste to the inside of that and the outside edges both sides, and drop that into position in the groove in the case. I'll cock the shutter by pulling the lever around so that I can get that into position easier, and then just push that into place. That's good. So we've got two holes here. This position is the screw that aligns the shutter in the camera, stops it from rotating, and the other is just a short countersunk head screw which drops in here. Now occasionally you'll find that this screw is missing. That's unfortunate, and it's very short, so if you go hunting for a replacement you're probably going to have to file it short. If you leave it long, it'll catch up mechanism inside the camera, the shutter, and you will end up with a shutter that does not work. So that's a very short screw. Now here I need to get this piece in place. This is that provides our detent for our aperture settings. So I'll get it under there. This tucks in to the case. That's that end. Right back here it should spring into position. It does, it tucks in. That just provides us our click stops. That's good. I need to clean my lenses up. And this front ring is just a spacer. It goes in at this position at the front. It's not from the back of the shutter. Where there are shims at the back of the shutter, they look slightly differently to this. This is smaller. It wouldn't fit there anyway. So I've got to clean these lenses because they look a little bit grimy, and then they can go back into the shutter, and once they're into the shutter I'll put that to one side, and I've got to do the camera body. I'll just put that rear group in place, tighten it with a friction tool. That's it. And the front group, that appears to have a little bit of haze in it. I'm wondering whether there's some haze behind that front glass. So I'm going to take this apart. To do that I've got to unscrew this retainer ring here, and it should allow me to lift that front group out. So I'll do that off camera. I've got to find a lens tube on a mechanism plate to hold this while I work on it. Well, you can see I've got that lens group screwed into a shutter case actually, and I've got a spanner, a lens spanner here, and this is unscrewing without much fight at all, which is good news and not expected. So I've got that started. I'm going to run that loose now using a toothpick. The spanner is a great thing to get things loose, but it's cumbersome to do a job like this where you're just trying to run the retaining ring loose. Here's our retaining ring loose. And I should be able to tip out that front group. I can. And I can see, as I hold this to the light, but you probably can't see, that the haze that I saw was on this surface here. And very probably on the back of this surface of this front group too. So I'll clean these components up and put it back together. That looks good. And I can pop the retaining ring back in place. I'll run that down using a toothpick, and I'll use the spanner to tighten up that last little bit. The advantage of using a toothpick for a job like this rather than a screwdriver tip is that a toothpick is not going to scar the ring, whereas a screwdriver tip most certainly would, particularly if you slip. So I'll get my spanner back in place. Tighten that up, and don't go overboard tightening something like that. It's not unknown for glass lens elements to break if the retaining ring is done up too tight, and if something unfortunate happens, like there was a speck of something underneath the glass at one point, if you over tighten it, it can just force it to break. So that's our front group nice and clean, and that can go back into the shutter. So one last blast of air to knock the dust off that. Put our little shim back in there, a little spacer. It's just a trim ring really. It serves no purpose. It certainly doesn't space the lens out from the shutter. The shutter is sitting on a lip, a raised lip inside there. So there's our shutter all done. The only thing left to clean here is the retaining ring, which I'll just give a quick wipe out now. And I can see my video camera is grizzling. The battery is just about flat. So with a bit of luck, I'll get this little task done before it packs it in for me. That was good. Worked well. Alright, time to start reassembling this camera body. So, where do I start? Well, I have the Bellows struts here. They're all cleaned. I've just lubricated the slots, top and bottom. I'm just going to run a smear of molybdenum paste through the shutter release linkage there. Run some on that post, that guide post. And pop the return spring on the guide post. I'm getting my bits and pieces here together. I need the transfer shaft that transfers the action of the cocking rack through to the front of the camera to the shutter. So I just put some synthetic grease on that. Sit that into place. That's good. Here's the little bracket that holds that shaft in place, and that in turn is held in place by this. So I've got to get that positioned down in place first, and it's always a bit of an act swinging this in without displacing things, so that you have to pull it out again and put things back where they came from. So I'll get this connection, this linkage correctly positioned. It slides onto the rail. and swing my struts into position, hopefully not displacing that bracket at the top. That looks fine. I'll bring those up into the... That looks good. Now I've got my 4 black screws that held that in place. The 2 prettiest screws I'm going to need to have those in the film cassette chamber because they're visible. Why can't I see that hole? It's just pushed over too far. That's better. Now I can see where I need to be. A quick look at these screws, grade them out. One of them will be underneath the leatherette. The leather rather, at the base of the camera. This one is probably the 3rd best screw. The ugliest screw, they're always a little bit distorted after you've fought them out of the camera. The ugliest one can go at the bottom where it's going to be hidden by the leather. It'll only ever be seen if somebody goes in. I'm just putting the spacer in underneath there now. It'll only ever be seen if someone goes to this much trouble to service the camera at some stage in the future. Well, if it's taken 60 years for someone to have to do it this time round, in 60 years' time it's certainly not going to be my problem. Run that screw in. I didn't do those screws up tight. I've got to get the 2 into the cassette chamber now. So I've got to get those holes lined up. And for some unknown reason, these screws are not lining up as easily as they normally do. But they are going in. Right, all 4 screws are in position. Now I can tighten them up. That's it. They're in position, the struts are correctly placed. Just check that they fold up smoothly, and they do. And I want to get this piece back in place. This is our focus mount. This has all been cleaned. I've cleaned this by hand. Again, I was just using naphtha, a cotton buds, and the toothpicks to scrape off the old grease rather, and make sure it's all nice and clean. The grease in this case had dried out, so effectively it was like a hard wax rather than a soft grease, and it wasn't exactly lubricating much. Do these 4 screws up, and if I collapse the struts, push the struts back into the body, I can put the 4 screws in that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. Get the screws all started and then you can go around and tighten them up, but wait till you've got them all started. That's that. So the bellows are now held in place. You can see they pulled out into position. Our focus helical. Well, I've got the inner and outer focus helical here together, and I've got them lined up so that my scribe marks are here at the point where the inner and outer are level with each other. Now I'm just going to run a bit of naphtha on this and work these threads backwards and forwards a bit. And this is just rubbing down any rough spots. They already clean all the old grease and rubbishes out of them. But dry brass does tend to have a rough feel to it. Right, so there we go. I'm going to lubricate this now and put them in place. And I've got some helical grease here to do that job. You don't need much grease. So without unscrewing it all the way, I'll put 5 or 6 small patches of grease around the outside on that exposed thread. Work that in. Check that that runs nice and smooth. It's good. Some around this face at the back here where it's going to sit in the mount. And there are 2 guide posts here and here, so I'll put a little bit of lubricant in there. And I'm watching, I've got my 2 scribe marks here and 1 up here, so I know my top from the bottom, so I know that that's the correct orientation. Check that that moves smoothly, it does. Put the retainer in place. I might just put a bit of, wipe some lubricant around that inner edge of the retainer. That's where it runs on this brass outer helical. Doesn't need much. That's enough. Put that grease away, I'm done with that. And 6 screws hold the retainer in place. Countersunk head screws. They're identical, 6 identical screws. They are also the same as the 4 screws which hold the focus scale ring in position. The 2 screws that hold the front plate in position are smaller. But these ones are all the same, so I'll just get 6 here. And run them in place. All in position. Now I can tighten them up. Check that it moves smoothly. It does. Our focus scale ring goes on here, and we have to match up our alignment marks, of course. So it's lucky we scribed lines across those so you can see exactly where it goes. That's good. 4 countersunk head screws. Don't go mad doing these up. They don't need to be tightened right up. If you do them up too tight, all you'll achieve is that you will distort the outer helical and make the focusing unnaturally stiff. Doing them up too tight is not a panacea. It will not stop the focus scale ring from pulling off over the heads of the screws if you haven't cleaned the focus helical and re-lubricated it properly. Making sure my alignment marks are lined up. Just nip those screws up. Check that the focus still runs smoothly, and it does. Here's our plate for the front of the shutter, front of the focus mount. And of course there are 2 small screws that hold this in place. That's good. So the coupling for the transfer shaft that transfers the action to the front of the camera to cock the shutter. That's the guide. Here is the front part of the transfer shaft. It's a sleeve that couples to the rear part. I've just wiped a little bit of lubricant on that, synthetic lubricant. Make sure it couples to the shaft. Yeah, that's in position. There's the shroud cover there. That's held in position with 2 screws. Just run the first one down lightly. And run the second one down. We've got to get that in place. I'm holding down the shutter release on the side of the shutter while I do that. Now typically what I do is here is I hold a bit of pressure on this from the inside to push this whole lot out to the outside edge while I do up the screws. That ensures that the gear is not pressing into the rack on the shutter. It provides a bit of backlash in the gear there, which is absolutely no problem at all. In fact, it's an advantage if you want things to run smoothly. I'm checking that the shroud does not rub on that focus scale ring as it revolves. So that's good. That's our focus mount all done. So the front door. Just giving this a bit of a squeeze to give it a bit of tension. Sometimes, this is a good example, but sometimes the doors have been damaged and stretched and not a snug fit in those grooves. We've got 2 cartridge paper washers. fit top and bottom of the door. If your camera doesn't have those, you can always make your own. You just need some nice thick stiff paper. Normally I'll hook it into the slot at the bottom, stretch the door up and over to get it hooked in at the top. Now we've got a couple of spacer washers that went in on that door, and there are 2 hinge pin screws. I'll get my screws sorted out. That's that one and that one. And I don't immediately see the washers, so that probably means they're sitting in my cleaner somewhere. I'll go and find those. The washers were there all along, I just couldn't see them. Just checking the state of this door. There's 2 washers here, they're both, one's thinner than the other one. Looking at the gaps at the top and the bottom of the door, the thin one should go to the top. I'm just lining up the hinge pin hole with the point of the tweezers after getting that washer in place. Drop in the screw. Run that down lightly. At the base of the camera, same deal. I've got the heavier of the 2 washers, the thicker of the 2 washers. Get that into place, line up the hinge pin hole. Drop the screw into place. Run that screw in and do it up tight. Go back to the top of the camera, do that screw up tight as well. Check that the door opens and closes smoothly. It does, and there's no undue rattle. So that part's done. I can turn my attention to the film advance.